Good morning, everybody. I've already started us off on the wrong begin soon slide. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties going on. So I'm going to now put up the slide that you should have seen. Hang on one second while I do that. You should have been seeing, I'm going to close this out. And okay. So let's pretend we're starting again and you guys just signed in and you are seeing this lovely slide that says the presentation begins soon. So you guys were sitting there waiting for me and we were all smiling here. And this was up here telling you that our topic was the history and challenges with progressive MS clinical trials and the need for equitable representation. And actually, we've changed the name of our presentation to the history and challenges with progressive MS clinical trials with a focus on the need for equitable representation. So you guys were reading that. This was all seamless. And then I came in, I stopped my share and I'm spotlighted, yes. And I say, good morning. Thank you for waiting while we began. I'm very excited to have everybody here. I want to welcome everybody to the second Sunday, live Sunday symposium presentation for Big October 2021. I'm super excited that we have our speakers here, 4 of them today, to discuss this topic. I think it's an important enough topic that one speaker wouldn't have done it justice. And I think having discussions around topics like this and hearing different perspectives is really important. For those of you who have just finished up the first week of the Wellness Challenge, congratulations. We'll be sending out some information about how everybody did during the first week, some stats, as well as some instructions on week 2 for the Wellness Challenge. So look for an email a little bit later this afternoon regarding that. And with that, I think I'm just going to tell you a little bit about why I chose this topic and why it's so important to me personally. As many of you know, I live with progressive MS, and having treatments available for myself and others living with progressive MS is obviously what's on most of our minds. And to have a treatment available, it's got to go through clinical trials. And then we need to make sure that the clinical trials are, representing everyone. And when I started MS Hope for a Cure, and I'm Alyssa E.J. Levy, president and founder of MS Hope for a Cure, which I probably should have said that in the beginning as well, but it's a Sunday morning. And I think most of you know that by now anyway. But I always thought I was the luckiest person to have MS. I had great insurance. I had living in New York City, had access to the best doctors. I had great support. And it was still really, really difficult. So when I started MS Hope, the main focus was to make sure that we could help those people who weren't as lucky as I was, and make sure they had access to the same resources that I did, which is why MS Hope right now, money that doesn't go to progressive MS research that we raise does go to pay the salaries of social workers that are working in MS centers that do serve underinsured people, uninsured, just the populations that need social worker guidance and help finding their resources the most. But if MS Hope didn't pay for a social worker, there wouldn't be one. So that's one way where we are constantly trying to, I don't want to say even the playing field, but make sure that as many people as we can find what they need. So this topic of progressive MS clinical trials and underrepresentation is important because it's those underserved communities that are not being represented in clinical trials as well. And we're going to discuss that. And also living with progressive MS most of the population, and hopefully this is no longer true with all the new wonderful relapsing remitting therapies we do have. But as we get older, a lot of people, that weren't diagnosed with primary progressive in the past have developed secondary progressive MS. And therefore, as we get older, that's when that's happening, making sure older individuals are also represented in clinical trials is super important. And that's what we're going to discuss today. So let me share my screen again and be patient as we try to do this. Well, so here we go. I'm going to actually put this up like this now. And I'm going to click because it already started. Okay, here we go. So this is how our talk is going to go today. We're going to start out with Dr. Matt Tremblay, and he's going to give us an overview of progressive MS clinical trials. He's going to talk about the purpose of the trials, the endpoints we're using right now, some examples of outcomes of clinical trials that have already happened, and some of the current limitations. Then Dr. Joseph Max Gutman is going to talk about what we know and what we don't know about progressive MS in general right now, and the challenges with not knowing, and then go over some of the FDA approved treatments we have and talk about what's on the horizon. Then Dr. Krupa Pandey is going to come and talk about the observations on the role of race as a contributor to the development of MS, examples of minority underrepresentation in trials, and perception versus reality of why minorities are underrepresented. And I think that's really important to look at. And then what success looks like moving forward. And then finally, Dr. Asaf Harel is going to come up and talk to us about underrepresentation of older individuals in progressive MS trials and the implications of underrepresentation on safety and efficacy, as well as the lingering questions on treatment strategies for a growing older MS population. And then he has the delightful job of summarizing what everybody said and bringing it all together. So we look forward to hearing that. So for right now, I'm going to stop my share again, and I am going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Matthew Tremblay, who is the Director of MS Research at the RWJ Barnabas Health MS Comprehensive Care Center in New Jersey. He completed his fellowship training in multiple sclerosis and neuroimmunology at UCSF in San Francisco before moving to Connecticut to head the UConn Health Multiple Sclerosis Clinic. He relocated to Northern New Jersey in 2018 to join Dr. Andrew Sylvester at the RWJ Barnabas Health MS Center. He was promoted to Director of Research in 2019 and leads a research team participating in multiple clinical trials and is actively involved in ongoing research on managing MS during the COVID-19 pandemic. I would now like to hand it over to Dr. Tremblay.
Thank you for the introduction, EJ. Hi, I'm Matthew Tremblay from the RWJ Barnabas MS Center. I'd like to thank EJ and the organizers for inviting me to speak today. It's very exciting to join my colleagues in discussing the important topic of challenges in progressive MS clinical trials. I'll be introducing an overview of MS clinical trials and some challenges and limitations we face in trying to find treatments to slow or stop progressive MS. The process of developing a treatment for a disease takes years, millions of dollars, and an incredible amount of work from scientists, clinicians, and especially patients. The cartoon in the center of my slide highlights the various steps along the way from discovery to FDA approval. The initial discovery stage, a target is identified in the laboratory that may be important in slowing or stopping disease. Drugs are selected that block or activate the biological target. The drugs are tested in models of the disease, both in test tubes and in animal models of the disease. If a promising treatment is found in preclinical testing, the drug advances into clinical trials, which are broken up into phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 before being considered by the FDA for approval. In phase 1, a small number of participants are treated with the medication to evaluate whether it is safe for use in human beings. If no concerning safety problems arise from the phase 1 trial, the medication advances into phase 2, testing the medication on a larger group of participants with the actual disease. In phase 2 trials, we also test safety as we did in phase 1, but also they're also used to select the proper dose of medication and evaluate whether there are signs of a treatment benefit. If everything from phase 2 looks good, in phase 3, the medication is given to a larger group of participants with the disease. The medication is evaluated for both safety and efficacy. In order to evaluate efficacy, outcomes are selected ahead of time to determine whether the treatment is effective. The primary endpoint is the measure that the clinical trial team selects before beginning the trial as the best indicator that the medication is effective at treating the disease. Secondary endpoints are usually selected as additional indicators or evidence that the medication is effective. The FDA usually requires at least 2 phase 3 trials with a clinical measure as their primary endpoint before considering approving a drug for treatment. In relapsing MS, the typical primary endpoint is clinical relapse. The number of relapses per participant per year is calculated and referred to as the annualized relapse rate. Secondary endpoints usually include MRI lesions and measurements of disability. By contrast, in progressive MS, relapses and MRI changes are far less common. We believe that because progressive MS may represent a later stage of the disease process with less inflammation and more neurodegeneration, as Dr. Gutman will discuss in much greater detail later. In progressive MS trials, the main problem is disability progression, and therefore the primary endpoint is a measurement of disability. Unfortunately, disability progression can be much harder to measure because it can manifest in multiple different ways. The typical primary endpoint for progressive MS trials is the Expanded Disability Scale Score, EDSS, a scale that's been used for decades as a measurement of disability. In most trials, a sustained change in EDSS over a period of 3 months or 6 months is how we define disability progression. Secondary endpoints often include walking speed, which is measured using a test called the 25-foot walk, and hand dexterity, which can be measured with a test called the 9-hole peg test. Some studies also look at MRI measurements of brain volume to determine whether the rate of shrinkage or atrophy is being affected by the medication. Everyone's brains start shrinking around age 25, unfortunately, but brains of people with MS shrink faster, particularly if the disease is active or the treatment is not working. A higher rate of atrophy may also lead to more risk of disability progression. More recent studies have started to incorporate some other promising endpoints, including biomarkers, meaning things that can be measured in the blood or spinal fluid. Some studies are also using what we refer to as composite outcomes. In composite outcomes, we use multiple measurements incorporated into an overall score that gives weight to different things, including the EDSS, walking speed, hand dexterity, and sometimes cognitive measurements, including processing speed. As mentioned, the EDSS is the most commonly used tool for measuring disability. The score is assigned based on the findings of the neurological examination, combined with a measurement of walking ability, need for assistance with walking, and the ability to perform activities of daily living. The scale is not a continuous measurement in the way that a walking time or a blood or CSF measurement would be. There are steps along the scale from 0, which means normal examination and normal physical function, up to 10, which is actually death. The limitations of the EDSS are well known. One is that scores are variable, largely because of the subjective nature of the scoring system. 2 different raters might give the same patient a different score because of a differing interpretation of what mild, moderate, and severe mean to them. The same rater might even give someone a slightly different score for the same findings because of the subjective nature. We refer to that as intra-rater variability. There's a large emphasis on walking ability in the EDSS, which is obviously not the only form of disability in progressive MS. Scores above 4 are defined by limited ability to walk specific distances without assistance of a cane or a walker. Here we look at some examples of clinical trials in progressive MS, some positive trials that led to approval of a medication for progressive MS, including ocrelizumab and siponimod. So in the oratorio trial, ocrelizumab was the drug being tested and later approved for primary progressive MS. In the expand trial, siponimod was being tested for secondary progressive MS and was later approved with that indication. And we also compare against some negative clinical trials where the outcome was considered negative and the medication did not go on to be approved for use in treating progressive MS. That includes the Olympus trial, which tested rituximab, a medication that's very related to ocrelizumab. And so it's surprising that that would be a negative trial, given that ocrelizumab was approved for use in primary progressive MS. And then more recently, the disappointing outcome of the MS-SPY2 trial, where we were testing high doses of biotin as a progressive treatment for all forms of progressive MS. In all of these trials, the EDSS was used as the primary outcome, although in the biotin clinical trial, they also added walking speed as one of the possible outcomes for a positive trial. One of the main differences when you look at the positive and negative trials is actually the age of the participants. So you'll see that ocrelizumab and siponimod had often a younger population, whereas the negative trials with rituximab and biotin, they included patients up to age 65. And as Dr. Harrell will discuss in more detail, we often don't include older patients in some of these clinical trials. And that's certainly an issue that needs to be addressed. The other difference that you can appreciate if you look at the percentage of patients who had gadolinium enhancing lesions when they entered the study, there's also concern that the positive outcome of the oratorio and expand trials may be related to the fact that the patient population had more inflammatory disease than in the studies that had negative outcomes. One of the hardest parts of treating progressive MS is judging whether the results of the clinical trials translate into benefits for the patient sitting in front of you. The main limitations of progressive MS clinical trials are the age of participants. So as mentioned, older participants are usually not involved in the clinical trials. And so if a patient is being treated for progressive MS and is older than the clinical trial patients, you'll always wonder, is it likely the patient will benefit, and is there potentially more risk to that patient? Successful clinical trials in progressive MS were largely composed of young patients. Also, it can be difficult to find demographic information about the patients who were participating in progressive MS clinical trials, but minorities are often grossly underrepresented, and Dr. Pandey will be discussing that further. Using the EDSS as the primary outcome measure has its limitations, as we discussed in an earlier slide. As a field, we need to determine the best outcome measure for progressive MS trials, perhaps including composite outcomes and biomarkers as potential ways to measure the benefit of medications being tested to help patients with progressive MS. Thank you for listening. I will now turn things over to Dr. Gutman to tell us more about the biology of progressive MS and available treatments and things on the horizon.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Tremblay. Before I hand it over to Dr. Gutman, I just want to introduce you to him and tell you a little bit more about him. Here we go. Dr. Joseph Max Gutman is the director of the NYU Long Island MS Comprehensive Care Center and the director of outpatient neurology services for NYU Langone, Long Island. He serves as a clinical assistant professor of neurology for the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, teaching neurology residents and fellows, and instructs medical students at NYU Long Island School of Medicine. He is a native Long Islander and is proud to treat local MS patients of all ages and across the disease spectrum. So right now, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Gutman. Thank you.
Sorry, forgot to unmute myself for a second. Hopefully everyone can see and hear me. So thank you, EJ, for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about this important topic. So I think Dr. Tremblay laid a good groundwork for our understanding of the challenges that we face in progressive MS. So I just want to highlight, as Dr. Tremblay said, what is progressive MS? What are our challenges in understanding and treating progressive MS? And what are some of the frontiers we're coming up to in progressive MS management? So I'm sure that many of you have seen these type of slides before in discussing progressive MS, but basically at its core, what progressive multiple sclerosis is it's multiple sclerosis where there is accumulation of disability in the absence of relapses or inflammatory or obvious inflammatory disease. And progressive MS comes in two flavors. One is secondary progressive MS, which is after patients have had a period of relapsing remitting disease, frequently about 10 to 15 years later, they can enter this phase of secondary progression, where instead of relapses, their disability is driven by progression with occasional superimposed relapses. And then there's primary progressive multiple sclerosis, which is multiple sclerosis that is progressive from onset, frequently discovered in a slightly older population than in relapsing remitting or secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. But what do we mean when we say progressive MS? What causes MS to progress? And I think that is a challenging subject for everyone. This is an article from one of the neurology journals talking about multiple sclerosis as a continuum, that, you know, there isn't always that strict line between relapsing remitting and secondary progressive MS, or even between those patients with primary progressive MS. And I think one interesting thing to note is that this article is from August of 2021. And so I think that, you know, despite over 100 years of understanding and research in multiple sclerosis, we still don't completely understand what drives progressive MS as a whole, and especially in the individual patient in front of us. You know, we have some ideas of what drives progressive MS, or at least some hypotheses. There's some thought that there may be lingering inflammation from relapsing disease, especially compartmentalized inflammation in the brain or the structures surrounding the brain, like the meninges. There can be accumulation of immune cells like B cells. There can be the degeneration of the nerve cells that have been damaged over time by relapsing disease in secondary progressive MS. There can be activation of other types of immune cells, like microglia within the brain itself. There can be toxicity from overactivation of the nerve cells, as cells need more energy to send signals after inflammatory attacks. There can be injury from mitochondria, from oxidation byproducts, and from excitotoxicity, where the cells are actually damaging themselves by over signaling required to send transmissions across the nerve cells. And the challenge in treating progressive MS is which of these mechanisms to target with therapies and the relative weight each of these has in an individual patient. So here's, I think, a slide that's obligatory in every multiple sclerosis talk that looks at the disease-modifying therapies that have been approved over time. I'm not going to go into much detail on this slide. I'm only using it to highlight while all of these drugs are approved for relapsing disease, only one, ocrelizumab, as Dr. Tremblay said, is approved for primary progressive multiple sclerosis. Many of the others have been approved for secondary progressive MS with activity, although very few have been tried in rigorous clinical trials of secondary progressive disease. The other thing to note is that all of these medications, broadly speaking, treat the immune system overactivation in multiple sclerosis and don't treat those other mechanisms of progression that I spoke about on the last slide, at least not to any significant degree. So to reiterate a little bit of what Dr. Tremblay said and to speak a little bit more, that we have many challenges in clinical trials of progressive MS. One that Dr. Tremblay highlighted well was how do we measure progression, especially in cases where progression can take years or even decades to accumulate? How do we see that in a short clinical trial lasting only a year or two? How do we choose a relevant patient population that's diverse of age, diverse of race and ethnicity, that truly represents the patients we're going to see in front of us in the clinic? How long should these studies last, especially when progression itself can, as I said, can take years or decades to accumulate? Then, as I mentioned on the last slide, what mechanisms do we target in progressive MS? Do we try increasingly strong anti-inflammatory mechanisms, or do we try for therapies that might have some benefit in terms of restoration or regeneration of the immune system? And then because progressive MS patients are frequently older, we need to take into account comorbidities. For example, if we're using a walking scale as an endpoint in our study, what if the patient has coexisting arthritis or other medical problems that can affect their walking as well? And that makes it even more challenging to interpret the results of these studies. So again, as Dr. Tremblay said, we frequently use the Expanded Disability Status Scale, or EDSS, to measure clinical trial outcomes in multiple sclerosis, which is a scale that is very heavily weighted towards walking, which is certainly one of the most important disabilities people face in multiple sclerosis, but certainly not the only disability that people face. I wanted to speak for a minute in a little bit more detail about the Oratorio trial, the study that Dr. Tremblay highlighted, looking at ocrelizumab in progressive multiple sclerosis. Here we have sort of the main clinical outcomes of ocrelizumab, an anti-inflammatory treatment targeting the B cells of the immune system, and seeing the progression of disability over time in patients treated with the drug versus the placebo, looking at disability progression over 3 months and 6 months. What you can see is that there is a clinically significant difference, that people treated with ocrelizumab over time do have slower disability accumulation than people treated with placebo. Unfortunately, all of the patients, regardless of whether they were treated with placebo or ocrelizumab, did have progression of their disability. Therefore, when I'm treating any individual patient in the clinic, I think we're sort of faced with the difficulty of, even if we're treating someone with ocrelizumab and they are accumulating disability, we need to ask ourselves how much benefit we're doing with these anti-inflammatory drugs, especially with potential side effects and potential complications like infection risk and things like that. We are looking at other newer anti-inflammatory drugs in progressive multiple sclerosis. One new class of drugs that are being developed are what are called Bruton tyrosine kinase, or BTK inhibitors. These work on another target on the B cells of the immune system. So this is sort of where the ocrelizumab would work on this target called CD20. Whereas BTK inhibitors, which are pills, work on a different target on the B cell called BTK that might be somewhat more selective for autoreactive B cells, and it's hoping might produce a little bit more of a targeted effect and would also have better penetration into the central nervous system to have more direct effects on the B cells that might exist locally in the brain and drive progressive disease. So this is just a slide looking at all of the different drugs that are being looked at in multiple sclerosis and in other autoimmune conditions. So I think in the next couple of years, we will hear a lot more about Bruton tyrosine kinase inhibitors, which hopefully will offer some additional help and additional options for patients with progressive MS as well as relapsing MS. But, you know, as I mentioned earlier, those drugs that I've talked about are all targeting inflammation. They're all targeting the lymphocytes, the other inflammatory cells in the central nervous system and the periphery, trying to stop progression that way. But what if we had a way to protect the nerve cells that had already been damaged, to promote remyelination and restoration of immune system function? So one thing that we can do to try to look at that is to promote the types of cells that can potentially remyelinate in the central nervous system. So this is looking at oligodendrocyte precursor cells. Oligodendrocytes are the cells in the central nervous system that wrap around the axons and produce the myelin sheath that allows for efficient transmission of nerve signals. And if we can promote the growth of oligodendrocyte precursor cells, it's hoped that we can promote restoration of neurological system functions. And we know a little bit about targets that both activate and inhibit oligodendrocyte precursor cell maturation into oligodendrocytes. So there have been some studies looking at results in people with some of these agents that can either inhibit or promote oligodendrocyte precursor cell maturation. One study called the RENEW study looked at opicinumab, which is a monoclonal antibody that blocks a molecule called LINGO. LINGO blocks the oligodendrocyte precursor cells. So by blocking the blocker, you promote activation of the oligodendrocyte precursor cell and oligodendrocyte precursor cell growth. Because this was an early phase study, they looked at a surrogate marker. They didn't look directly at progression in multiple sclerosis. They looked at another inflammatory target, which is optic neuritis. And they looked to see whether these drugs helped people heal more quickly from optic neuritis when their optic nerve was damaged from demyelination. And these people, after being treated with steroids, were randomized to either getting the active drug opicinumab or a placebo, and they measured the speed of visual impulse transmission down the optic nerve with a technique called visual evoked potential. Now, unfortunately, while this drug did show a trend towards benefit in people getting the drug, it did not reach its statistically significant clinical outcome. And therefore, the drug at this point is not approved, although there are certainly other active studies of other agents that are designed to promote oligodendrocyte precursor cell maturation and remyelination. And I think that this is going to be truly the next phase in treating progressive MS, not just treating the inflammatory phase of disease, but trying to target remyelination and restoration of nerve cell function itself. So thank you all for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing and hand things over to EJ to introduce Dr. Pandey, who's going to speak about equitable representation in MS clinical trials.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Gutman. I want to let everyone know about questions. I forgot to mention this earlier, that if you do have any questions, make sure you're writing them down so you can ask later, but you can also, we may have time to take one or two questions through the Q&A button you have on the right. If you click there and send in a question, we may have some time. If not, we'll answer all your questions in our next session where you'll be able to see and hear everybody. So I will now share my screen. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Krupa Pandey. Hang on. Oh, wait, I can't do that yet because I have to be able to. Okay, I'm not going to share my screen with that. I'm just going to read her introduction. I apologize. We're having a lot of little technical things pop up today, but Dr. Krupa Pandey is the director of the MS Center, director of clinical research of the neurology department at Hackensack University Medical Center, and assistant professor of neurology at the Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine. Her proudest moment in the last few months has been crocheting a hat taught to her by her 9-year-old son. With that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Pandey.
Thank you, EJ. I want to thank her as well as the organization for inviting all of our, myself and my colleagues for speaking on this important topic. I find it that people who are passionate about MS care, like EJ and all of the people that help her with the organization, really help to really promote more education on different topics. So thank you very much, EJ. Dr. Tremblay and Dr. Gutman did a wonderful job in laying the groundwork as well and building upon this topic. And today we're going to focus a little bit on the need for equitable representation. So what is equitable care? Equitable care means that anybody who is afflicted with a condition, especially in this case with MS, has the same access, the same availability, and the same opportunities that everyone who has the disease has. However, we've noticed that there have been challenges, especially in the last 20 years. We've noticed that the role of race as a contributor in terms of developing MS is unclear. So what are some of the observations that have even brought that question up in our minds? Well, we've noticed that, especially as caregivers for MS, both myself as well as the 3 physicians that are caring for MS patients specifically, that we've seen in our clinics that African Americans, Hispanic Americans who come in have a higher incidence of MS compared with individuals who are originally from either African or countries where there are many Blacks, or even Latin American or Hispanic countries. So they're countries of origin. We've also noticed that these patients have higher rates of disability. Their MRIs may show more disease burden either when they present or as they progress with the disease. One of the challenges has been, both of my colleagues, Dr. Gutman as well as Dr. Tremblay, spoke about clinical trials, progressive MS, but we don't really know what the incidence is of progressive MS, specifically in African Americans and Hispanics. We currently know that 85% of the population of patients with MS in the US, which totals near 1 million people, 85% of those people have relapsing remitting MS, and 15% of them have primary progressive MS. What's unknown is how many of these are African Americans or Hispanics. And why aren't we doing a great job at characterizing this? What are some of the obstacles that we have? So EJ is going to move on to the next slide for me. Thank you, EJ. So some of the contributing factors is that there really is this misconception of what MS is in many of these social, societies as well as communities. Oftentimes patients who are of African-American descent or Hispanics will come in and say to me, that within my community, it's not okay to be disabled. I also hear from patients of all different races that all the time they say, I have MS, but people don't know. They say, well, you look so good. Well, what is a patient with MS supposed to look like? Why can't they just be who they are? And I think this is a huge contributing factor to part of the acceptance of the disease and the diagnosis. Many times we look at economic stability. Now, that just may not mean having the financial resources, but even the time to do that, right? Many patients who are afflicted with MS may be between the prime ages of being able to work and having employment, and they don't want to lose that job. There's this fear that if I take time off from work, if I go to the doctors, if I participate in clinical trials, I may not be able to do that and may not be able to take time off from work to do that. Employers may not be understanding. So there's this concept of, if I take time away to participate in a trial, I may not have the economic resources moving forward. Then we speak a little bit about education. All of you that are on this symposium virtually are able to do so because you have the means to obtain the information of where the symposium took place, what time. There might be this cultural norm of, let me educate myself a little bit more to find out more about the disease. So again, we're going back to that social and community perception. And then moving on, which kind of segues to access to specialized care. Patients may not have that. They may live in a neighborhood or in a state where they may not have access to MS centers that have clinical trials or the availability. And then we move forward to neighborhood build. We speak a little bit about if that neighborhood that the patient lives in doesn't have easy access to transportation, they may not be able to get to that specialized center. They may live in a building which only has stairs and not an elevator. And especially when we're talking about the primary progressive population, which may have disabilities that progress, they may not have the ability to climb down a flight of stairs easily. They may not have, they may live in a state or in a climate where it's very hot. And especially in those hot days, if they don't have access to air conditioning, they just may not feel well enough to go. Especially important, as Dr. Gutman spoke about, remyelination and the balance of inflammation and how that varies in primary progressive MS. We speak about food stability and how diet is playing such an important role in inflammation as well as remyelination. Dr. Gutman spoke about vitamin D and how that plays an important role. Well, if patients don't have access to foods and supplements and the ability to gain those things that can promote vitamin D, they may not be able to remyelinate. And then there's inconsistent availability of MRIs as well as testing. Dr. Tremblay did a great job of explaining how clinical trials work and what are the measures. However, if the patient doesn't have the availability to get an MRI or access to care to get that diagnosis of primary progressive MS, that it may pose a challenge in terms of getting these populations and getting them in to represent themselves in clinical trials. And then most importantly, we still don't have a clear understanding of which medications work the best in certain races and ethnicities. So why is that? EJ, I'll have you move on to the next slide. Thank you. Part of that is that both Dr. Gutman and Dr. Tremblay alluded to the fact that many of these clinical trials, which have been going on since the mid-90s, have really had robust information in terms of populations primarily represented by Caucasians. These trials that I've listed here on the chart are primarily relapsing and remitting trials. And I had to do a little bit of digging, but we were able to find out is that in all of the trials, we had less than 10% participation by Blacks, African Americans, as well as Hispanics, in which most of the time, we didn't even know what the representation of Hispanic population was in these pivotal clinical trials that led to FDA approval. However, we do know that there is an incidence, at least, that's much higher than this in regards to the incidence as well as disability in terms of, MS. So I think these trials highlight a very important fact, which is we need to have more representation, which will then allow better equitable care. And I want to point out here, especially in the last trial that Dr. Gutman, especially in his session, spoke about, which is the Ocrevus, which is used for primary progressive MS and is currently the only FDA approved treatment. That trial actually only had 4% involvement of African Americans in that clinical trial. So EJ, who's going to move us on to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of those factors. Why might those reasons actually exist in terms of unfair representation or inequitable representation? Some of that dates back to mistrust, which started in the mid 1900s with several trials or several areas of research that had to do with unfair treatment or unfair involvement of patients of certain ethnic backgrounds in clinical trials. There's been a lot of focus on the Tuskegee trials and how there was unfair treatment of Blacks. And how just the last participant just recently passed away because of, just unfair treatment. The other parts that we're talking about is a delay in diagnosis. One of the things that both of my colleagues, Dr. Gutman and Tremblay, spoke about is that there's this scale that we use to enroll patients in primary progressive or progressive clinical trials, the EDSS scale. That EDSS scale, which both of my colleagues showed, had different epochs in terms of how patients fared in terms of their ambulation or their disability. Now, most of these clinical trials required that patients had to be within the EDSS scale of 3 to 6.5. And what that basically means is that a EDSS scale of 3 means that you have at least one part of your neurological system which has moderate disability. And an EDSS scale of 6.5 means that that patient uses a cane. They can't be in a wheelchair. They have to be able to at least walk a certain distance in a certain time frame. And they also have to have function of their hands that allow them to put pegs within a certain board. Now, if we have a delay in diagnosis and the patient is already far advanced, they automatically can't participate in that clinical trial. If there's lack of awareness, if there's lack of education, and patients aren't able to get to those centers, it automatically delays them in terms of participating. Then we move on to cultural beliefs and misinformations about trial, and that patients may receive inferior care actually if they're in a clinical trial. However, when you look at most clinical trials, they usually offer patients free MRIs, access to an MS or a neurologist that has specialized care in MS at least once every 3 to 6 months. Most blood work is usually offered for free. And then more importantly, patients are able to get even, Dr. Tremblay spoke about exploratory outcomes. So some of the ancillary testing, which could be spinal fluid or a lumbar puncture, which can help in the diagnosis, is also offered for free. Many patients, however, if they are interested in this or have access to that education, don't know where to get involved. All 4 of us that are on this call that work at a specialized MS center are involved in clinical research. However, patients may not know which of our 4 centers offer which trials. And that can be very frustrating because we live in a society where we're overwhelmed by information, and that can be tough for a patient who might be scared and hasn't even accepted the diagnosis yet. So that can be an important barrier to care. And then, like Dr. Gutman mentioned, concurrent medical conditions may exclude that patient. So for example, if we're looking even at somebody who is now enrolled in a clinical trial, and let's say they're able to walk and participate in that trial, but later on they develop sensory symptoms, the investigator may not know, are those sensory symptoms due to breakthrough MS disease, or is it because of the concurrent medical condition? So it's not just that the patient themselves may not be able to participate because of the pre-existing condition, but also the sponsor of the clinical trial may not want that patient in there because they want to make sure that the medication that they're giving the patient really works for the disease that they're investigating it in. Finally, there might be some misconceptions about legal status. That's been a huge challenge, especially in the last few years, given our current climate with legal status. So patients may not feel comfortable participating or volunteering for a clinical trial, not knowing what the ramifications may be on their legal status. And this has been a huge problem in certain areas of this country. EJ, please move on to the next slide. Thank you. So are these misconceptions really true? Is it true that patients who are from these ethnic backgrounds may have cultural reasons not wanting to participate? Is it true that they may not have access to care? Well, a recent study was done in actually over 2,500 patients with MS. Unfortunately, again, we had slight underrepresentation in terms of the Black population, but it did have very good information that was provided. And the reason that the study was done is that investigators asked patients with a diverse study population, right up front, they addressed some of the concerns that patients had voiced in terms of clinical trials. And their goal was, if we communicate properly how this research is being done, if we told the patients upfront what to expect from the clinical trial in ways that they understand, could this help with in terms of enrollment in clinical trials having to do specifically with MS? So EJ will show us on the next slide what those questions were. So on the left of the slide, we're going to see what those questions were, and we're going to start off at the top. The first, right off the bat, the question was, is this topic interesting to me, right? So the topics particularly, this study was done specifically in patients with MS. So is MS the topic interesting to me? Are the researchers going to tell me what the study results are when the study is over? Am I going to get the results of the individual test? Do I believe that this research is going to help people with MS? Am I going to be paid for participating in the study? Will the study pay for costs such as transportation and childcare? Am I going to get free healthcare as part of the study? Did my doctor personally tell me about the study? So what we see in the middle column are these different bars of different colors. The gray is out of those 2,500 patients that participated in the trial, they either opted not to tell the investigators or they themselves didn't know particularly what ethnic group they belonged to. Then the orange bar shows us the non-Hispanic patients and the blue bar shows us Hispanic patients. Overall, what it showed is that you had fairly comparable rates of patients who agreed that they would participate in a clinical trial if all of the questions on the left appealed to them and they were able to answer them and they felt like they got the answers to those questions. Moreover, if you look on the right of the slide, it then further breaks down those patients who identified it as that non-Hispanic category, how many of them were white and how many of them were African American. And I think what's really fascinating is that both in the bar, the section in the middle, which identifies Hispanic patients, as well as then on the right, which further breaks it down into white and African American, is that all of the different ethnic groups agreed that they felt that the topic was interesting to them, that they felt comfortable, that they would participate if they got the individual test results, and so on and so forth, based on those questions on the left. But I think this highlights, as we move on to the next slide, that success in minority research maybe might not actually be what we thought. It may not be that there is this level of mistrust. And maybe what we really need to do is identify those risk factors which are unique to each racial group by explaining to the patients, what the topic is. Why is it important? Maybe we need to have tailored approaches in our recommendations for treatment and wellness plans based on what patients are saying to us. Maybe if we communicate with patients and give them educational materials, cultivate this level of patient trust by actually having physicians as well as different members of the office staff speak to the patients and actually address to them in ways that they understand, maybe we can improve participation in these clinical trials. I think one of the questions highlighted an important thing that we had spoken about before, which is access to care. If we provide transportation, if we provide childcare, if we can even provide dedicated time that the patient can come away from work through just the ADA Act, right? The American with Disabilities Act says that an employer has to give a patient with disability time off from work to accommodate to their medical needs. This may actually help provide equitable care in research. We'll have EJ move on to the next slide, please. So I think this is an overarching, but I think it's a great way to summarize how do we diversify our approach in order to reach equity. I think Dr. Tremblay and Dr. Gutman both spoke about, exploratory outcomes in terms of genetic factors, knowing who is going to be at a higher risk for progression, especially when we talk about primary progressive MS. But we're not going to have those genetic factors and we're not going to know who's going to progress quickly if we can't get certain populations involved in clinical trials. And I think Dr. Tremblay spoke a little bit about the different phases of research, but I think one of the most important areas of research is not just clinical trials, but even epidemiological studies. Many of our centers actually have epidemiological studies that are ongoing that really look to capture what are those important factors that may actually light that match for MS. Next, we're going to spot, the other way to diversify our approach to reach equity is disease education, as well as access to care. If patients can't access education, if they can't access ways to speak to somebody about what they've learned, then we're not going to get equitable care. And then finally, on the left side, we're going to look a little bit at cultural respect and trust. And I think that we can only foster those two things if we have providers that, number one, care about taking the time to talk to patients about what MS is and educating them a little bit, just like our colleagues are doing today. And then finally, making sure that we educate patients and let them know that the earlier that we can get them diagnosed and involved in any type of trial or any type of treatment, the better that they're going to fare. So I thank you very much for giving me a little bit of your time today. And now I will have Dr. Harrell, who's going to speak a little bit about equitable care in not just race, but as well as age. And for those of you who are interested, our center is actually doing educational program, not just for the lay population, but as well as healthcare providers on Saturday, December 4th, which is virtual. This will be up on our expo table if anybody wants to register for that. And we're going to have speakers from across the country, as well as NYU, UCSF. They're going to speak a little bit about equitable care, not just in race, but as well as the LGBTQ community, which can be extremely important as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. And now I would like to introduce our last speaker, Dr. Harrell. And Dr. Asaf Harrell subspecializes in the treatment of multiple sclerosis and related neuroimmunological conditions. He currently practices full-time as the director of the MS Center, both at Lenox Hill Hospital on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and at the Northwell Neuroscience Institute in Manhasset, New York. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Harrell.
Thank you very much, EJ, and thanks for having me. It's truly an honor. Wanted to end this hour of discussion by speaking a little bit about aging, progressive MS, and the implications of this topic with regards to clinical trials in progressive MS, in MS in general, and then also the implications with regards to treatment of people with MS. So these, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a list of major modern MS clinical trials in general. And these are specifically of FDA approved disease modifying therapies for MS. And so as you can see, it's an exciting time in the field of MS. There's a lot of movement. There has been a lot of movement over the last 10 to 20 years or so. And we've had a lot of, these are mostly, mostly positive trials, mostly trials that were successful listed here. But, I wanted to, when we do a deeper look into, well, who were these people who actually got enrolled in these trials? Well, Dr. Pandey discussed racial inequalities. I wanted to bring to the forefront the discussion of, well, most clinical trials in MS really have been focusing on the younger population. So most clinical trials have focused on people 18 to 55 years of age. A few of them up to 60, up to 65 years of age. But really, when we're looking at the elderly population, anybody over the age of 65, that population has not been included in any large phase 3 pivotal MS clinical trial. And this is a list of MS trials in general, but when you look at progressive MS trials, again, of medications that are FDA approved. You think about the Oratorio study, that's Ocrevus, and progressive MS, that was only up to 55 years of age.
Right.
From May's end,
let me read it off of your thing.
studied in Cole, and like Dr. Gutman had mentioned, was only approved by the FDA for SPMS with activity, people that had relapses or new lesions. And then Ascend, which looked at Tysabri in secondary progressive MS, that was ultimately didn't show a benefit on EDS, on the primary endpoint, but then maybe showed some benefit on hand function. But regardless, most of these studies were really targeting the younger population. So this is important because our MS population is aging. So in 2015, we had a study that showed that about 20% of people with MS in general were over the age of 65, and that's 1 in 5. That's a pretty large part of the population that were essentially not represented in pivotal clinical trials. We think that it's a little bit, that number is changing, and some estimates have it at about 25%. So things are changing, and this overall trend is due to a few different factors. So number one, we do have improved therapies. We've had a lot of success in treating the early side of things, relapsing, remitting MS, and that has led to increased longevity. We do have increased availabilities of MRIs, increased awareness, which leads to increased diagnoses, and that can happen at any age. We've seen a higher increase, an increase in the rate of what's called late onset MS, which is a diagnosis after age 50, and a very late onset MS, which is a diagnosis after age 60. And this now accounts for about 5% of new diagnoses, whereas in the past, it's sort of an older age was almost thought to be almost exclusionary for the diagnosis. And then, of course, our population is aging in general, right? And so of course, the MS population specific will also be aging. Why is this important for progressive MS? Well, people with progressive MS tend to be older. Progressive MS is certainly more prevalent in the older population. And remember, I mean, this includes both people with secondary progressive MS who, back when they had relapsing remitting MS, maybe 20 years ago, we didn't have, well, could be that we didn't have any therapies at all back in the day, or didn't have as many options as we do now for relapsing remitting MS. So it could be those people who unfortunately developed secondary progressive MS. We do think that that's less common these days with new options. But then also people with primary progressive MS that again tend to be on the older side at diagnosis. So just to recap, trials for existing MS therapies really have specifically excluded people over the age of 65, and there's really not enough safety and efficacy for this growing population. We really have been just extrapolating information that we have from these clinical trials for the older population. So why is this a problem? Why does this matter? Well, with regards to safety, people who are older, who are above the age of 65, may be undergoing what's called immunosenescence, which really, I mean, is a complicated, easy word for a complicated issue, which really describes an overall decrease in function of the immune system, which, if this were to happen in combination with immunotherapies, could increase the risk of infection. We don't really have enough data on the subject in this population. The other aspect of this is that as people age, well, there could be other conditions that other coexisting conditions, which we refer to as comorbidities, which Dr. Hamid at our table actually has a talk on. So feel free to check that out, and are also more likely to use medications, which can also impact, both of these can impact safety of immunotherapies, safety of disease modifying therapies for MS, or can pose problems with interactions, drug-drug interactions. So most, and it's important to note that, even outside of the elderly population, most people who do have some of these comorbidities, regardless of age, oftentimes are excluded from these pivotal clinical trials. So we talked about the safety. Well, what about efficacy? And that's another sort of question that we have in the field. Relapses and new lesions are not as common in this age group. So whether we talk about relapsing remitting MS or whether we talk about progressive MS, as people get older, relapses and new lesions are not as common. And most clinical trials for MS in general have looked at relapse rates as a primary outcome. For progressive MS, of course, it's the EDSS, which is an imperfect metric in and of itself that both Dr. Gutman and Dr. Tremblay, really did a good job in illustrating. Relapse rates are not as relevant of a marker in older individuals. The EDSS comes with a lot of different, limitations. And so future biomarkers are necessary. We'll get to that in a moment. The other thing is that if you look at if you look at studies that are out there, there is a trend. So people that are younger, people in their 20s and 30s, seem to derive a higher benefit from disease-modifying therapies than people who are older in their 40s or 50s. And this may denote a decrease in benefit even going further in somebody's 60s and somebody's 70s. So we really don't know. That's a take home. With age, again, there is less of this overt inflammatory component, relapses, new lesions, less common. There may be a smoldering inflammatory component, which people are looking at. So whether that's, that has to do with microglial activation, like Dr. Gutman mentioned, we don't quite understand what is driving the pathophysiology of progressive MS. But it seems that it's different than with the younger MS population or the relapsing remitting MS population, and may require a different therapeutic approach. And as I mentioned before, older individuals are more likely to have progressive MS. Most individuals with late onset MS have progressive MS, or at least 50% do. And when we talked, my colleagues, spoke previously about medications that recent clinical trials that were positive, that showed an effect in, that made inroads in the treatment of progressive MS. We're talking about Ocrevus and Mayzent that had successful clinical trials recently. Really, they limited recruitment to people who, actually I should say below, but excluded people above 55 and 60 respectively. And so, we really, have limited data. So this, all these, we can get to the reason why this may be, but it's really complex. And one of the factors may be that, well, if there's less of an overt inflammatory component later on in life, in older age, well, if you're studying immunotherapies, maybe you do want to or it makes sense to focus on the younger population. However, this does not negate the fact that people, that the MS population is growing. We don't have as much data as we need, and people with progressive MS tend to be older. So this leads to questions in the field. So there are definitely many lingering questions with regards to this topic. The main one, as I alluded to earlier, is it safe and is it effective for somebody with MS who's older than 65, who's, let's say, who has progressive MS, for example, to initiate one of these therapies for MS? And take home is that we don't know the answer to that. There are few studies. There was a recent study that I found interesting from the Brigham of just under 200 individuals who really, it was a longitudinal study. They looked at people older than 65 at their center, and they showed that people were still using disease-modifying therapies above the age of 65, and there was generally a good safety of therapies, but really it was not large enough to study efficacy, of course, and also probably not large enough to really study safety. I found it was interesting that even if somebody was over 65, over the years, there was a higher number of individuals who began to use disease-modifying therapies, again, despite the fact that none of these therapies were studied in this population. And especially the use of B-cell therapies like Ocrevus. And this, is no doubt due to the approval of Ocrevus in primary progressive MS. But again, it hasn't really been studied in this age group. So questions do remain from this standpoint. On the flip side, I just want to say, well, what happens if somebody is doing very, very well? Somebody has had relapsing remitting MS for a while. They're doing well. Their MRIs are stable. They haven't had any new relapses. They're feeling fine, but they're still on one of these disease-modifying therapies. Maybe it's an older interferon. Maybe it's something that's relatively more recently approved. Is it safe to stop? And this is a question that we have in the field. One study did suggest that, well, what it showed is that people older than 60 who stopped therapies did pretty well. About 10% of people chose to restart medication after the fact, and there was only one relapse that occurred. So, that suggests maybe that it's safe to do so, but that's not enough data to really help us guide individuals in the clinic. We are awaiting results of the DISCOMS or DISCO-MS study, which randomized people to people that were older than 55 to either stopping medication or continuing medication if their MS had been stable for a long period of time, and really that may help shed some light on this topic. So just to recap, there is a really, as our population is aging, there is a growing need for more safety and more efficacy research aimed at the needs of older people with MS, and especially when it comes to progressive MS, because that's really the next step in research, and it is more prevalent in the older population. So I just wanted to recap the hour, just to thank my colleagues here. Dr. Tremblay gave us a really nice discussion and overview of progressive MS clinical trials and the challenges that these trials face. Dr. Gutman discussed the current unknowns and the current knowns. With regards to what drives progressive MS, the challenges again that the research faces, and gave us a view of potential future treatments on the horizon. Then Dr. Pandey gave us a deeper dive into one of the big challenges in the field, which is to say racial underrepresentation in progressive MS clinical trials and MS clinical trials in general. With an eye on how how that can be improved going forward. And finally, I discussed the underrepresentation of older individuals in MS trials and the implications that this underrepresentation has when it comes to our knowledge of safety and efficacy of medications. So there's no doubt that MS treatment has really advanced. I mean, it's really been revolutionized over the last 1 to 2 decades, and there's really it's a hopeful time in this at the moment in the field, and there's certainly lots of opportunities for future advancements, lots in the pipeline. So we've certainly come a long way. It's been we've done a very, very, very good job in relapsing remitting MS. Relapsing MS in general. There still are unmet needs for progressive MS, and in order to have the same successes that the field has had in relapsing MS, to have those same success in progressive MS, we really have some needs. And so the first need is really to develop an improved understanding of the underlying pathophysiology driving progressive MS. So that's, Dr. Gutman gave us a really nice overview of that we don't really know what drives progressive MS. Is it smoldering inflammation, microglial activation? Is it neurodegeneration? Is it iron deposition? We don't know. So, that needs to be, a big focus going forward. And it is a big focus going forward. And then based on that knowledge, we need to develop therapeutics with novel mechanisms of action that targets this underlying pathophysiology. So it may be different than what is driving relapsing or remitting MS. After that, we need to then develop improved ways to study and monitor progression. So we talked about how relapse rates are not really the way to study things going forward, I would say. And obviously the EDSS, we talked about the challenges with that, the fact that it's our metric, but it's not the it's not an ideal metric. It's what we have, and there are limitations to it. So either having more composite clinical metrics, but also potentially having involving advanced biomarkers, so either blood biomarkers or imaging, really could then lead to improved metrics and endpoints in clinical trials. Finally, of course, we need to improve racial inclusion in clinical trials, and we could do that by improving outreach, improving education, and really cultivating trust while addressing the needs of the underserved communities. And then finally, we need to recognize that our population is growing older, our MS population is growing older, and progressive MS is more common in this population, and it tends to manifest differently in different age groups. And so this is really an important topic as well as we think about developing future progressive MS clinical trials and treatments. And that would be it. And thank you very much. And I will pass it off to EJ.
Thank you so much, all four of you, for a really wonderful discussion. And I've been getting a few texts about how great every single one of our speakers was today. And I'm excited to get to some questions because I know there are. Quickly before I do that, I just wanted to share my screen again and bring you to our home screen of Big October. And this just show you that up here, if you click on Symposium presenters and wellness instructors, you will find our four speakers for today. They're in alphabetical order. And if you click on any of their tables, you will find their slides down here if you want to download those slides and a little bit more about them. And then also, since they are all from our from MS centers who are participating in our expo, for those of you who have not gone over to see the wealth of information over there, you can just click on MS Community Expo and you will end up here. And these are all our comprehensive care centers. And as Dr. Pandey and others referred to, they have more information on this topic and other things about their centers all here. And lots of MS organizations and our pharmas that sponsored us. And thank you to Novartis for being our platinum sponsor, and to Biogen, Sanofi Genzyme, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Genentech for their support as well. The other thing I want you to know about our lobby is, if we go back to the homepage, if you guys go to your homepage right now, you will see that the next featured session is our post-presentation open discussion. So when we sign off here right now, you simply go here, click join session, and myself and our four speakers will meet you there now to answer any questions. So thank you so much for joining us. I apologize for those of you who heard Sarah and I mumbling in the background during Dr. Harrell's talk, and those of you who texted and told me to mute, I appreciate that as well. All right, see everybody in just a few moments over here at our post-presentation discussion. Thanks, everyone.